In the years before capture, Japanese soldiers and pilots lived in a world shaped by stories carefully fed to them by the imperial state. Every speech, every newspaper headline, and every broadcast worked to paint a single picture. America was a land of softness, a nation too spoiled by comfort and material wealth to ever fight with true discipline. They were told American industry was chaotic, its workers lazy, its soldiers unwilling to endure hardship. For men trained to worship sacrifice and obedience, these stories created a powerful sense of superiority. In their barracks, Japanese pilots laughed about the image of clumsy American planes. They believed they would face machines built for show rather than battle, weapons that could not withstand the precision of imperial engineering. The thought of American aviators untested and unprepared only reinforced their confidence. Propaganda posters often depicted the United States as a nation of indulgence, men distracted by chewing gum, jazz music, and fast food, rather than sharpened by discipline. Such portrayals shaped the minds of countless young officers who came to believe victory was inevitable. This arrogance ran deep. Victories across Asia had only confirmed the idea that their empire was destined to dominate the skies and sea. From Manchuria to the Philippines, the myth of superiority grew stronger. In their worldview, America was already defeated before the war truly began. What they expected to meet in the air was not a determined enemy, but a scattered force of amateurs flying flimsy machines. It was in this mindset, fueled by pride and overconfidence, that Japanese soldiers first encountered the strange, brown American planes, and the moment they realized these machines were not a joke, but a nightmare, their carefully built illusions began to collapse. The arrogance that colored Japanese views of America was not born from words alone, it was hardened by victories. In the early years of the war, Japanese forces swept across Asia and the Pacific with stunning speed. The fall of Singapore, once thought to be an unshakable British stronghold, was celebrated as proof that Western powers lacked resolve. The capture of the Philippines further reinforced the belief that American troops could not stand against the discipline of the Imperial Army. Pilots, too, carried this confidence into the skies. Their Zero fighters dominated early air battles, maneuvering with agility that seemed unmatched. Reports told of American and British planes falling like leaves before the skill of Japanese aviators. Each success made the image of the enemy grow weaker in their minds. By the time Japanese officers spoke among themselves, they did so with a quiet certainty that the war was theirs to win. Even beyond the battlefield, daily life reflected this rising pride. Soldiers in occupied territories saw how quickly Western defenses had collapsed, and believed the same would happen wherever the empire turned its attention. In their barracks and mess halls, the conversation was not about whether victory was possible, but about how soon it would come. These victories cemented the illusion that America was too clumsy, too indulgent, too unfocused to mount a real challenge. The Japanese fighting men carried that conviction with them, certain that the strange brown planes they would one day face could not possibly alter the balance of power. When Japanese pilots first caught sight of the unusual aircraft approaching from the horizon, they were puzzled. These were not the sleek, sharp-nosed fighters they had grown accustomed to dueling in the sky. Instead, the planes carried a broad, almost awkward frame, their surfaces painted in a brownish hue that stood out against the clouds. To the trained eyes of imperial aviators, they looked clumsy, more like lumbering transports than machines meant for combat. In their cockpits, Japanese pilots laughed among themselves, certain that these brown planes were another example of America's supposed incompetence. The aircraft seemed heavy, even ungainly, lacking the grace and razor-like edges of the Zero. The impression was one of bulk over brilliance, and many assumed they would be easy prey. A few even joked that such machines must have been cobbled together hastily, meant only to scare or distract, not to truly fight. But the strangeness of the planes held their gaze. They carried a presence in the sky, unlike anything the Japanese had encountered before. The odd design, the powerful hum of engines that could be heard before the planes were even close, suggested something different was at work. They were too numerous to ignore, too steady in their formation to dismiss outright. In those first moments, confusion mingled with amusement. To the pilots of the Empire, these curious brown planes seemed like proof that America was not only weak, but foolish. daring to send such ungainly machines into the theater of war. What none of them realized then was that the same shapes they mocked would soon become symbols of overwhelming firepower, rewriting everything they thought they knew about the balance of the skies. In those first encounters, the reaction from Japanese pilots was almost uniform. The strange brown aircraft seemed far too slow, far too large, and far too clumsy to be taken seriously. Accustomed to dueling in swift, agile Zeros, they saw these machines as little more than airborne targets. Flying barns, some called them, remarking that they would never last against the sharp strikes of Japan's elite. The mockery was loud and confident. From their altitude, Japanese airmen believed the planes revealed America's supposed weakness in design and strategy. Their movements looked sluggish compared to the cutting arcs of Japanese fighters, their silhouettes so different from the streamlined shapes of European aircraft. To the trained eye of a Zero pilot, such aircraft appeared to defy every principle of aerial combat: bulk without speed, presence without menace. Rumors spread quickly across squadron. Stories were shared of pilots who claimed these brown planes were barely capable of climbing or maneuvering, that they could be downed before they had a chance to fire back. Many took the sight of them as confirmation of propaganda they had long been fed. America was indulgent, careless, and technologically behind. The thought that these curious aircraft might pose a genuine threat seemed laughable. Ironically, their very confidence blinded them to the danger ahead. The Japanese viewed the skies as their domain, certain their skill and speed gave them dominance. Mockery became a shield, a way to dismiss the unsettling new presence before them. Little did they know that behind the laughter lay the seeds of their greatest surprise, that these slow and useless planes would rain down a storm of fire that no pilot's arrogance could withstand. Up close, the so-called brown planes revealed themselves to be nothing like the clumsy transports Japanese pilots had first imagined. Their hulking shapes were not accidents of poor design but deliberate choices. The fuselages were thick and rugged, built to endure punishment that would have torn lighter machines apart. The brown paint that had seemed so odd from a distance was in fact carefully chosen camouflage, blending with earth and forest below, masking their approach against a wide range of backdrops. The engines were perhaps the most striking feature. Each plane roared with a power that felt excessive to the Japanese eye. Enormous radial engines that dwarfed anything they had in their own arsenal. The sound of them was impossible to ignore, a deep, throbbing growl that carried across skies and into the stomachs of those who heard it. To pilots trained to prize silence, subtlety, and nimble motion, the sheer presence of these engines was bewildering. Nor were these machines delicate. Every panel, every rivet seemed designed to resist stress, heat, and impact. They looked heavier, slower, and less refined than the sleek lines of the Zero, but there was a sturdiness in their frames that hinted at endurance. They could dive, take punishment, and climb again, something Japanese pilots would learn to their horror. To men raised on propaganda about American incompetence, the sight of these massive brown-painted machines was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. They did not fit the image of a decadent enemy. Instead, they suggested an industrial power capable of producing aircraft that valued function over form, survival over elegance. What began as laughter quickly shifted into disbelief, as the truth of the design became harder to dismiss. When Japanese pilots compared these curious American planes to their own Zero fighters, the differences were glaring. The Zero was built for agility, light, fast, and razor-sharp in its maneuvers. In a duel it could twist and turn with astonishing grace, outpacing nearly anything in the sky. Pilots prided themselves on this elegance, convinced that speed and skill outweighed any other factor. But the Zero carried a hidden cost. Its light frame came at the expense of armor, and its thin skin offered little protection once enemy fire struck home. A few well-placed bullets could tear it apart. Its fuel tanks, unprotected and vulnerable, often turned small hits into flaming disasters. The Zero demanded perfection from its pilots because it offered no forgiveness. By contrast, the brown American planes seemed to have been built with the opposite philosophy. They lacked the nimble grace of Japanese fighters, but their bulk and weight gave them an unsettling durability. Where a Zero might fall in flames after a burst, these planes could keep flying, engines still grinding, wings still holding, even with smoke trailing from their frames. The contrast created unease. For the first time, Japanese airmen began to sense that elegance might not be enough. Against a machine that could survive punishment and return fire with staggering force, Agility alone seemed fragile. The laughter that once filled cockpits grew thinner, replaced by the first hints of doubt. These clumsy planes, once mocked as unworthy opponents, now carried an air of menace that was difficult to explain and impossible to ignore. The first time the brown American planes opened fire, every assumption the Japanese pilots had carried dissolved in an instant. What they had dismissed as heavy, awkward machines suddenly revealed themselves as engines of destruction. From their wings erupted streams of bullets, not a few scattered bursts, but an unending hail that lit the sky. The 8 heavy .50 caliber guns thundered together, spewing a wall of lead so thick it seemed impossible for anything in its path to survive. Japanese pilots, accustomed to quick dogfights of speed and maneuver, were stunned by the sheer volume of fire. The air that had once felt like their domain was suddenly hostile. A single pass from these aircraft could shred formations, rip into fuel tanks, and send planes spiraling down in flames. Where the Zero relied on precision and skill, the Americans had built a weapon that overwhelmed through brute force. The shock was visceral. Men who had once joked about these flying barns now found themselves dodging a rain of bullets that tore through metal like paper. The sound of those guns, deep and relentless, carried a psychological weight as crushing as the physical destruction. It was not the duel of equals they had imagined. It was survival against a storm. In those chaotic moments, laughter turned to silence. The planes they had mocked as useless proved terrifyingly efficient, transforming the skies from arenas of confidence into theaters of fear. For the first time, Japanese pilots realized they faced an enemy that fought with resources and firepower beyond anything they had prepared for. The aftermath of those first encounters left Japanese squadrons shaken in ways they had never experienced before. Pilots who had taken off brimming with confidence now counted their comrades missing, their aircraft reduced to smoking wrecks scattered across the sea and fields below. The mocking words that had once followed the sight of the brown planes vanished, replaced by an uneasy silence in debriefing rooms. Reports told of entire formations torn apart in minutes. Zeros that once danced effortlessly through the air were shredded by torrents of bullets they could not dodge. Even skilled veterans, men with dozens of kills to their names, found themselves helpless against the relentless firepower. The skies, once a place where Japanese agility reigned, had become a killing ground shaped by the raw strength of an enemy machine they had laughed at only weeks before. What unsettled them most was not just the loss of planes, but the realization that these aircraft fought in a way they could not match. A single attack run from a squadron of brown planes could deliver more fire than an entire wing of Zeros firing together. It was as if the Americans had rewritten the rules of combat, trading grace for overwhelming destruction, and winning. Fear crept into the ranks. Disbelief gave way to whispered respect, grudging at first, but undeniable. The Japanese had entered the war believing themselves invincible in the skies. Now they faced a truth that gnawed at their pride. The enemy they mocked had built a weapon they could neither outfly nor outlaugh. When the brown American planes turned their guns toward the ground, the devastation they unleashed stunned Japanese troops in trenches, convoys and outposts. Strafing runs began with a distant rumble, the thunder of engines growing louder until the sky seemed to vibrate. Then came the torrent, streams of .550 caliber rounds stitched across the earth in long, merciless lines, tearing through vehicles, supply dumps and soldiers with terrifying precision. The effect was more than physical destruction, it was sensory overload. The roar of engines drowned out every other sound, the rattle of bullets shattered nerves, and the sight of dirt and metal exploding in every direction left soldiers frozen in disbelief. For those on the ground, it felt less like facing an enemy and more like standing beneath a storm designed to annihilate everything in its path. Japanese positions that had once been secure crumbled in seconds. Wooden trucks burst into flames, ammunition stores erupted in chaotic explosions, and infantry scattered helplessly under the relentless fire. Even those who managed to dive for cover were not safe. The sheer density of bullets tore into the ground, sending shards of earth and steel flying through every opening. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers who had once believed themselves hardened by years of war found themselves trembling, their confidence shredded as completely as their defenses. The mocking laughter that had followed these planes when first seen in the skies was now unthinkable. Instead, the very sight of their silhouettes overhead sent shivers of fear through every man who looked up. These strafing runs were not simply attacks, they were declarations. The Americans had brought a weapon so fearsome it seemed to bend the battlefield to their will. For the Japanese it was terror from the sky. Among captured Japanese soldiers, Stories of the strafing runs spread like whispered confessions. Men who had survived spoke not with pride but with trembling voices, describing the rain of lead that seemed impossible to escape. They remembered the moment when the engines roared overhead, followed by the sudden tearing sound of bullets slicing through air and steel. For many, the only instinct was to throw themselves flat against the earth and pray the storm would pass. One prisoner recounted how a convoy was reduced to burning husks in seconds, the air filled with smoke and screams before he even understood what had happened. Another remembered the dirt exploding around him, fragments of rock and metal cutting his face while he lay powerless in a ditch. They spoke of comrades vanishing in bursts of fire, of men too terrified to even lift their heads to run. What left the deepest mark was not only the physical destruction, but the sense of utter helplessness. Against fighters in the sky there had always been the hope of maneuver, of skill, of chance. Against these strafing runs there was nothing to do but endure. The firepower was overwhelming, mechanical and merciless, a storm unleashed at the press of a trigger. The prisoners admitted that even hardened veterans had broken under this onslaught. Some could not stop shaking for hours afterward, their nerves shattered by the experience. To them the brown plains were no longer oddities but harbingers of dread, symbols of an enemy whose strength seemed limitless. The disbelief among Japanese pilots deepened when they realized that bringing down these brown American planes was far harder than expected. Time and again they watched as aircraft riddled with bullet holes refused to fall. Wings were torn, fuselages shredded, engines smoking, yet somehow the machines continued their course, stubbornly refusing to yield to gravity. Stories spread quickly through squadrons. Pilots reported firing long bursts directly into the hulking frames, only to see them keep climbing, their engines growling defiantly. One Zero pilot swore he had seen a brown plane limp home with an entire section of its tail nearly severed. Another claimed he had watched one spew smoke for miles, its surface pocked with holes, yet it still managed to land safely on its side of the lines. This defiance of expectation struck at the heart of Japanese pride. Their own planes, designed for speed and maneuverability, could rarely survive more than a handful of hits. The thought that American pilots could return to base in machines battered beyond recognition left many in awe, and quietly afraid. What unnerved them most was the consistency. These were not isolated incidents or lucky escapes. Again and again the brown planes endured punishment no fighter should have survived. The rugged frames, the heavy armor, the sheer power of their engines turned every engagement into an uphill battle. In the eyes of Japanese airmen, these aircraft were no longer clumsy curiosities. They had become something far more dangerous. Machines that not only hit with terrifying force, but could also take punishment and return for more. That resilience demanded a grudging respect, tinged with growing fear. In prisoner camps, the legend of the unkillable brown planes took on a life of its own. Japanese pilots, now captives, shared stories that blurred the line between fact and myth. Around barracks and mess halls, they described encounters where entire squadrons had emptied their guns into a single aircraft, only to watch it limp back toward American lines, smoke trailing but wings still steady. One officer told of chasing a damaged plane across miles of ocean, convinced it would finally plunge into the waves. Instead, the machine climbed stubbornly, disappearing into the cloud. Another swore he had seen one return to base with its canopy shattered, its body scarred with hundreds of holes, and yet its pilot still alive and unshaken. Each tale carried the same haunting theme: these planes refused to die. The more these stories spread, the greater their aura became. Pilots began to speak of the machines as if they were more than metal and rivets, as if they carried a will of their own. The brown paint, once mocked as strange and ugly, now seemed almost symbolic of an indomitable force that could not be stopped. Even skeptics, those who dismissed exaggerations, could not deny the pattern. Again and again the planes returned when by all logic they should have been wreckage on the ground. This resilience fostered both fear and fascination, reshaping the way the Japanese saw their enemy. By the time the war dragged into its later years, the unkillable brown planes had become a whispered legend, a reminder that America's strength was not just in numbers, but in machines that seemed to embody survival itself. For years, Japanese airmen had been fed a steady stream of imperial propaganda declaring their fighters the best in the world, and their enemies soft, untrained, and incapable of true sacrifice. The brown American planes seemed at first to confirm this narrative, bulky, inelegant machines that appeared laughable beside the sleek curves of the Zero. But as the war dragged on, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Time and again, those very planes proved not only survivable but devastatingly effective, turning battles into nightmares for the men who once mocked them. The collapse of belief came slowly, creeping in with each mission that ended in heavy losses. The stories of strafing runs, of indestructible machines limping back to base, and of relentless firepower clashed directly with the myth of invincibility that Japanese command had drilled into its pilots. Propaganda insisted that Japan's spirit and discipline would always triumph over brute force. Yet in the skies, the opposite was playing out. Spirit and skill met walls of lead and machines that refused to fall. And the results were catastrophic. Pilots who had once taken pride in imperial rhetoric now spoke in hushed tones, doubting words they had once repeated with conviction. The laughter that once followed the sight of the brown planes had long since turned to silence, and then to dread. To face them was no longer a matter of confidence, but of survival, a gamble few believed they could win. For many, this realization cut deeper than the loss of comrades. It was the crumbling of an identity built on the belief that Japan's warriors were unmatched. The brown planes had shattered, not just formations in the sky, but the very ideology that once held the pilots together. In the quiet of the camps, Japanese officers and pilots found themselves speaking words they never would have dared during the height of the war. Around wooden tables and in dimly lit barracks, conversations shifted from boasting to quiet admissions of fear. The brown planes came up again and again, not with laughter now but with the weight of humiliation. One pilot admitted that he had once mocked the machines openly, calling them clumsy barns in the sky. Now, he confessed, the memory of their relentless fire haunted him more than any other battle. Another officer spoke of how it felt to dive confidently into a skirmish, only to see his comrades shredded in seconds by the wall of bullets the Americans could unleash. It was not fighting, he whispered. It was slaughter. These talks carried the sting of betrayal. The Imperial Command had promised superiority, had sworn that discipline and spirit would overcome American machines, yet the reality they had witnessed showed the opposite. Strength and abundance had crushed pride and sacrifice, and it left the men wrestling with despair. Even among hardened veterans, there was no longer denial. Some admitted that their confidence had collapsed the moment they realized they could not match the Americans in production, firepower, or even endurance. The humiliation was heavy, but beneath it lingered a strange, reluctant respect. For the first time, these officers recognized that their enemy's strength was not an illusion. The propaganda was, and the bitter taste of that truth weighed heavier than defeat itself. By the late stages of the war, fear of the brown American planes had spread so deeply that it began to affect Japanese pilots before they ever took to the skies. Stories circulated of men who hesitated on the runway, engines idling as they searched for excuses not to launch. Others reported sudden mechanical faults, often more imagined than real, giving them reasons to delay facing the inevitable. For a warrior culture built on sacrifice, these cracks in resolve were shocking. Pilots who once fought with absolute confidence now admitted, at least to themselves, that going against the American machines felt like volunteering for suicide. They knew what awaited them: walls of bullets from 8 heavy guns, planes that would not fall even after soaking up impossible punishment, and comrades cut down in missions that ended before they truly began. Some refused missions outright. Commanders tried to silence the whispers, but rumors still spread through mess halls and sleeping quarters. Men who had once laughed at the clumsy planes now confessed that the mere sight of their silhouettes overhead made their stomachs twist with dread. The refusal to fly was not just fear of death, it was the collapse of belief. The pilots understood that their skill, discipline, and spirit, once considered unshakable strengths, meant little against overwhelming firepower and indestructible machines. To step into combat was no longer to fight on equal terms but to walk knowingly into defeat. In those moments, the myth of Japanese invincibility crumbled entirely. The brown planes had broken not only formations in the sky, but also the will to fight in the hearts of men trained to never yield. While Japanese pilots carried the burden of direct combat, civilians soon bore witness to the destruction these brown American planes could unleash. From the ground, the raids were unlike anything many had imagined. Villagers and townsfolk described the terrifying sight of formations roaring overhead, blotting out the sun with their massive frames. Then came the strafing runs, bullets striking streets, warehouses and fields with such intensity that the earth itself seemed to shake. Mothers clutched their children, pressing them against wooden walls that offered no real protection. Farmers watched helplessly as convoys of food or carts of supplies were torn apart in seconds. Even when the planes passed, the sound of engines lingered like a curse, leaving people too afraid to step outside. The psychological effect spread quickly. Civilians began to see the enemy not as distant or abstract, but as an unstoppable presence above their daily life. Letters carried whispers of despair, that no fortress, no field, no village could truly be safe from the sky. The laughter that once accompanied propaganda about America's clumsy machines had vanished, replaced by dread every time the distinctive hum of their engines approached. For many, the helplessness was the hardest blow. Unlike soldiers, they had no weapons, no tactics, no chance to resist. They could only endure as the rain of fire cut through their towns and countryside. Children grew up associating the brown plains with terror, while adults felt the bitter sting of betrayal from leaders who had promised the homeland was secure. The shock extended far beyond the front line. The brown plains had not only broken squadrons of trained pilots, but had also pierced the spirit of the Japanese people themselves. By the time the war reached its final years, the Japanese no longer saw the brown American plains as curiosities or clumsy targets. Instead, they had come to symbolize something far greater: the sheer weight of America's industrial power. Each encounter in the sky was a reminder that behind every squadron of planes stood factories that never slept, assembly lines that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. Pilots began to understand that what they faced was not simply aircraft, but the visible edge of a vast machine of war. The endless waves of planes, all rugged, all heavily armed, all seemingly indestructible, were proof that America's strength went beyond tactics or technology. It was industry in motion, the ability to build and supply faster than anyone could destroy. Letters and testimonies from captured officers revealed this growing realization. Some admitted that the true battle was never just between pilots. It was between nations' capacities to produce. And in that arena, Japan was hopelessly outmatched. The brown planes, with their durability and relentless firepower, were not only weapons but symbols of a country that had mastered the art of mass and efficiency. The awe came with despair. Every time a damaged plane limped home instead of crashing, it reinforced the futility of resistance. Every time fresh formations filled the skies after a brutal battle, it reminded them that American supply lines seemed endless. The propaganda of Japanese superiority could not stand against what they now saw with their own eyes: America's ability to turn factories, resources, and manpower into overwhelming dominance. In those moments, the laughter that had once greeted the brown plains was gone. What remained was silence, and the recognition of a truth too large to ignore. In the end, even the most loyal officers and pilots were forced to admit the truth: Japan could not match America's power. In prisoner camps, conversations that once brimmed with arrogance shifted to quiet acceptance. Men who had believed in the invincibility of the empire now spoke with a tone of weary respect. They recalled how at the start of the war they had laughed at the ungainly brown plane. Now those same aircraft were remembered with a kind of grim reverence. They were not beautiful, one pilot admitted, but they always returned, and they always struck harder than we expect. Another officer added that the planes symbolized more than just firepower. They represented a nation whose factories, workers, and resources worked in unison, something Japan could never hope to equal. This recognition carried a sting of humiliation, but it also brought clarity. The war had not been lost in the skies alone, but in the broader contest of endurance and supply. For the Japanese, the brown plains had become the most visible reminder of that imbalance. They were machines that embodied America's strength: rugged, tireless, and backed by an industrial machine that no amount of courage or sacrifice could overcome. For many prisoners, that realization marked the end of illusion. The propaganda of superiority had collapsed, replaced by a grudging, resigned respect. They no longer mocked the planes that once made them laugh. Instead, they remembered them as the messengers of defeat, and as the proof that Japan's future could not be secured by pride alone. When the war finally ended and Japanese prisoners began their long journeys home, many carried with them stories that seemed almost unbelievable. Among the most retold were those of the brown American plane. Around train stations, aboard repatriation ships, and in hushed conversations with families, these tales emerged, half war story, half cautionary memory. Former pilots described the first time they saw them, how they laughed at their clumsy shapes and dull paint. Yet those same voices admitted that the laughter quickly gave way to fear once they witnessed the devastation the aircraft could bring. Ground crews spoke of strafing runs that shattered entire convoys, of skies filled with a relentless rain of bullets. Infantrymen told of the dread that spread through units whenever the low rumble of those engines approached. For ordinary citizens, hearing these accounts was jarring. Propaganda had long painted the American war machine as weak and disorganized, yet returning veterans painted the opposite picture. The brown planes became shorthand for everything America had represented during the war: abundance, durability, and a relentless ability to fight on. Though retold with bitterness, there was also humility. Some acknowledged that the planes symbolized more than firepower. They were proof of an enemy that had mastered endurance and coordination in ways Japan could not. In sharing these memories, the veterans were not only recounting battles lost, but also passing along lessons about misplaced pride and the dangers of underestimating an opponent. The brown planes, once dismissed with mockery, had become enduring symbols of a war that showed Japan the limits of belief and the crushing weight of reality. In the years after the war, the memory of the brown American planes did not fade. For Japanese veterans, they became more than just a weapon of war. They became symbols of a hidden strength that had once been The planes represented an America that had been underestimated, a nation whose true power was not found in elegance or appearance, but in resilience, firepower, and overwhelming numbers. Historians later noted how often these aircraft appeared in prisoner recollections, not only as machines of destruction, but as markers of psychological defeat. To many, they were the moment when pride cracked, when propaganda gave way to the undeniable reality of industrial and organizational dominance. The psychological impact was just as decisive as the physical, leaving scars of respect that lingered long after the guns fell silent. For some veterans, this legacy carried a quiet redemption. They acknowledged that the planes taught them humility, forcing them to see beyond illusions of invincibility. In a strange way, the very machines they once mocked became lessons in the dangers of arrogance and the importance of preparation and adaptability. To audiences today, the story of the brown planes serves as a reminder that true strength often hides in plain sight, overlooked until it can no longer be denied. The laughter of the Luftwaffe and Imperial Japan turned into silence, then into fear, and finally into respect. The legacy was clear. These aircraft were more than war machines. They were symbols of a psychological turning point, when the world learned that underestimation could be as deadly as any bullet, and that the simplest-looking opponent could hold the greatest power.